In a small Paris apartment, a man sat at a desk rewriting identities, one document at a time. Outside, trains were leaving, names were being called, and entire families were vanishing into a system built on paper. But what if that paper could lie? What if ink could disappear? And with it, the identity that sealed a person's fate. In the middle of a war controlled by records, one man turned chemistry into resistance and quietly helped thousands slip through the cracks of history. In occupied France during the Second World War, a person's fate could depend on a small piece of paper, an identity card, a ration permit, a birth certificate stamped by a government office. To most people, these were ordinary documents, but under the German occupation, they became instruments of control. They recorded who you were, where you were born, and sometimes, most dangerously, whether you were Jewish. For many families, these papers were the difference between freedom and arrest. In 1944, hundreds of Jewish children in France were about to disappear into hiding. Resistance groups were arranging routes that would move them from city to countryside, from orphanages to farmhouses, from one safe place to another. But there was a problem. Before those children could move through checkpoints, train stations, or village streets, they needed identities that would not attract attention. They needed documents that said they were someone else. And those identities had to exist before the authorities started looking. In a small apartment in Paris, a young man named Adolfo Kaminsky sat at a desk covered in paper. Stacks of official forms were spread across the table. Bottles of chemicals stood beside them. Rubber stamps and ink pads were arranged carefully within reach. At first glance, the room looked like the workspace of a quiet clerk or a hobbyist. But the work being done, there was anything but ordinary. Inside that room, identities were being erased and rewritten. And for hundreds of children, the success of that work would determine whether they lived or disappeared into the machinery of deportation. Years earlier, Kaminsky's life had followed a very different path. He had been born in 1925 in Buenos Aires, Argentina, the son of Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution in Eastern Europe. While he was still young, the family moved to France and eventually settled in Normandy. By the late 1930s, Kaminsky was a teenager with a curiosity for science. He was particularly interested in chemistry, how substances reacted, how colors changed, how stains could be removed. At one point, he found work in a small textile dyeing shop. The job involved treating fabrics that had been stained during manufacturing or transport. Some stains were easy to remove. Others were stubborn, requiring different chemicals and careful experimentation. During this work, Kaminsky noticed something unusual. Certain inks that were considered permanent could sometimes be removed with the right chemical mixture. The trick was to dissolve the ink without damaging the fabric beneath it. It required patience, testing, and a careful understanding of how different compounds interacted with dyes and paper. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a technical detail of the trade. But in a few years, that small discovery would become a powerful tool. Because in occupied France, identity itself was written in ink. And and if the ink could disappear, so could the identity attached to it. When Germany invaded France in 1940 during World War II, daily life changed quickly. The country was divided into zones controlled by the German military and by the collaborationist Vichy government. Jewish families were required to register with authorities. Identification documents began to carry markings that indicated Jewish origin. For officials conducting inspections, these markings made it easy to identify people who were subject to arrest or deportation. Paperwork became part of a vast bureaucratic system that tracked individuals through files, registries, and identification cards. In this system, a person's identity existed not just in their face or voice, but in the documents they carried. If those documents said you were Jewish, you could be detained. If they said you were someone else, you might pass unnoticed. Kaminsky's own family experienced the danger of this system firsthand. In 1943, they were arrested and sent to the Drancy internment camp, which served as a transit point for Jews being deported to concentration camps. When Kaminsky and his family arrived at the camp, they entered a place designed to hold people in a state of uncertainty. The camp itself had originally been built as a modern housing complex on the outskirts of Paris. But during the occupation, it was converted into a detention center for Jews who had been arrested across France. Families were brought there after being taken from their homes, workplaces, or hiding places. Inside the camp, thousands of people waited. They slept in crowded rooms with limited supplies. Guards controlled the entrances and exits. Information about what would happen next was scarce. Many detainees knew that trains were leaving the camp regularly, carrying people east toward unknown destinations. What people did understand was that once someone was placed on a deportation train, they were unlikely to return. Eventually, Kaminsky and his family were released because they held Argentine citizenship, which complicated their deportation status. But leaving the camp did not erase the memory of how fragile a person's security could become when bureaucratic systems turned against them. After leaving the camp, Kaminsky began working with members of the French resistance who were organizing ways to help Jewish families evade arrest. These networks needed many kinds of assistance: guides who knew rural roads, couriers who could move messages across cities, and people who could provide shelter to those in hiding. But they also needed something more specialized. They needed documents. Kaminsky joined a small underground group that specialized in document forgery. At first, the work focused on altering existing identity cards. Official documents were difficult to reproduce completely from scratch, but if the ink could be removed from certain sections, the paper itself could be reused. Kaminsky developed chemical solutions that would dissolve ink markings without leaving visible traces. Producing a convincing identity document required far more than simply writing a new name on a piece of paper. Government documents contained many subtle details that officials relied on when checking authenticity. Paper varied in texture depending on the office that produced it. Ink colors differed slightly from one administrative department to another. Rubber stamps left distinctive impressions that could reveal whether they were genuine. Kaminsky approached the problem like a scientist. He studied authentic documents closely, sometimes examining them under magnification to understand how ink soaked into the fibers of the paper. Removing the ink required careful balance. If the chemical solution was too strong, it could damage the paper. If it was too weak, traces of the original writing might remain. After the ink disappeared, the document had to dry before new information could be written. Then came the urgent request. Resistance networks were preparing to move hundreds of Jewish children into hiding. But before the children could travel, each of them needed documents that matched their new identities. Birth certificates, baptism records, and ration cards were required. Altogether, hundreds of individual papers. Kaminsky calculated how fast he could work. At his fastest pace, he could process around 30 documents in an hour. Later, he would describe the pressure in simple terms. If he rested for an hour, dozens of people might lose their chance to escape. So he worked through the night. As Kaminsky worked, the hours began to blur together. Sheets of treated paper were placed around the room to dry, while new ones were prepared. Ink bottles were opened and closed repeatedly as names and dates were rewritten. Members of the resistance quietly arrived to deliver forms or collect finished papers. Despite the urgency, the work could not be rushed. A single mistake could place the person carrying that document in immediate danger. By the time the work ended, the room was filled with stacks of completed documents. Hundreds of identities had been quietly rewritten. The children began leaving their shelters gradually. Moving such a large group all at once would have drawn attention, so smaller groups traveled separately. Some children were accompanied by adults who presented themselves as relatives. Others traveled with new guardians. Each child carried the documents produced in Kaminsky's workshop. At train stations and checkpoints, officials occasionally asked to see their papers. The documents looked ordinary. Nothing suggested the identities on those pages had been created only days earlier. One by one, the children passed inspections and disappeared into the countryside under new names. After France was liberated, many members of the resistance quietly returned to civilian life. Kaminsky eventually devoted himself to photography. For decades, he rarely spoke about the work he had done. To him, the chemistry had been simple. People needed documents. He had the skills to produce them, so he used those skills. Looking back, the significance of his work becomes clearer. The occupation relied heavily on systems of paperwork and records to control populations. But those systems assumed documents could not easily be altered. Kaminsky proved otherwise. With chemistry, patience, and precision, he dismantled identities written in ink and replaced them with new ones. Inside a small apartment in Paris, a quiet war had been fought with paper and chemicals. And sometimes that was enough to save a life.